Today, we're going to talk about the very first scientific paper I'm aware of that investigated the potential association between COVID-19 vaccines and cancer rates. Specifically, they were looking at the difference in cancer hospitalizations between non-vaccinated and vaccinated people. And this particular paper looked at one Italian province with entire province population, so fairly large number of people. So let's take a look at it because it's definitely interesting results. And trigger warning, I want to let you know that whether you belong to the non-vaccinated group or the vaccinated group, or whether you belong into the anti-vaxxers or the pro-vaccine group, these results that these authors have found will most likely upset you one way or another. And the reason why is because there's some information that would be good news to one type of group versus the other. So hey, don't get upset at me. I'm just a messenger, so don't shoot the messenger. I'm only delivering pizza of information, and the toppings might not be to your liking. So don't throw tomatoes at me, of course, unless they're, organic and locally sourced. All right, it is what it is. Personally, I don't really care what information comes out of science. I'm not for one type of group or another. Of course, I'm biased though, but my allegiance is more into finding information because a certain group of people might be suffering, and what can we learn in order to alleviate suffering? That's probably where I lean towards the most. So I don't really find any pleasure in finding one type of information versus the other. And I know that some of you sometimes, based on the comments, get upset based on the information I present. My point here is that face the information that might not be to your liking of the form of a narrative that you created in your head. And if you're experiencing cognitive dissonance because of the type of information I'm going to be presenting, think of it more like a yoga for your brain, and it's a good exercise for you. And just simply breathe through it. And speaking of which, if you want really good quality breathing exercises, check out one of my videos on how you can use breathing to activate your vagus nerve. All right, let's get started on this. My name is Dr. Mikola Rasek of Myriad Genomics, and let's begin. So this paper was given to me by on one of the social media platforms. So this is already a few months old. I missed it, but most of the literature these days I get from you, the audience members, or people that already know about the channel. So thank you for that. I found this really interesting, and I like this type of science. I think while I mentioned this is the first of its kind, I do believe we will have more and more of this type of science in the future, where we will be comparing vaccinated versus non-vaccinated health outcomes. Now remember, the clinical trials that were done in order to compare vaccination versus non-vaccination to determine its effectiveness at the time. Eventually, we took the placebo group, meaning the group that was non-vaccinated, and almost everyone in that group was vaccinated very soon after an entire clinical trial began. So that means we don't really have a proper comparison group anymore. And that means this is all we have left to do, is to be able to make these type of comparisons like the one I'm going to be discussing in today's video. What did they do? What did those authors do? They're Italian, by the way. So like, as I mentioned, this was one of the Italian provinces that was investigated. Almost 300,000 individuals were investigated. So nearly all of the residents, and that excluded already all of the children under 10 years old, which was maybe, from memory, somewhere around 30,000 individuals, give or take. I always give you a warning when I give you any of these stats. They're all subject to being incorrect because of my faulty memory, but I usually give you corrections in a video with a text when I make these mistakes. So it's just the way it is, right? I really have bad memory, ironically. All right, so this is what they did, and that's what did they do? What kind of comparison did they do? This is this is the strange part. Let me explain this because this part might be a little bit confusing. So obviously they looked at unvaccinated or non-vaccinated people, so that's the easy part, but they compared it to vaccinated group of people, and they divided vaccinated into two categories. So category one was anyone who had one or more vaccine. Sounds straightforward, okay? And that included Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Novavax. All right, those are the all the vaccines. They also categorize these same people in another form, and they compared non-vaccinated against those who had 3 or more shots. So any of these vaccines that I mentioned, and it could be a combination of any of these, plus, and this is the strange part, they also included Johnson and Johnson vaccine, but they counted that one as 2 shots already. So if you had Johnson and Johnson plus one any other vaccine, that they already counted that as 3. So what does that mean? If you just had one Johnson and Johnson vaccine, you did not belong in either of these groups, and they don't comment on that anymore. And perhaps there weren't any, because those who had this shot was very, very small group of people anyway. So far that's still easy part. Here comes the little bit convoluted or complicated part. How did they compare them? Because they wanted to compare these two groups of people for 2 things: mortality outcomes, and this is all cause mortality, meaning death for any reason. So it doesn't matter what you die from. It's just you either dead or alive, period, done. Okay, so it's simple. So that's the comparison number 1. Or comparison number 2, they looked at hospitalization rates for cancer. Now, why that specifically? Why did they look at hospitalization rates? And the reason why is because the cancer registries, this is pretty much global, but Italian cancer registries, and this is the same thing happening in US and Canada, typically lag 4 or 5 years behind the current moment in terms of having accurate information in it. This is one of the reasons why we still do not have fully accurate picture as to what might have happened with the cancer rates during the pandemic. Now this information is starting to emerge. I made some videos on this topic, but that's the reason why. So what that means is that for the information, if we want to know anything about, say, cancer rates of 2025, we have to look at 2028, 2029, maybe 2030 or so, right? So you get the point. But they were able to look at hospital records. They were able to look at all the currently available medical records. So they were able to see hospitalization rates for any of these individuals in that Italian province and see who was hospitalized for cancer. And that acted as a proxy for the cancer rates. It's not ideal, but that's what they were able to do in order to get as accurate information as possible that is current. All right. And they looked at it from January 1st, 2021, which is the date that mass vaccination started in that province in Italy, all the way till the end of 2023. So we're looking 2 years, 2-year time span. But the comparison is a little weird. So why? Because remember, I told you they looked at vaccinated people in 2 different ways. So those who had 1 or more shots versus those who had 3 or more shots. Now, for 1 or more shots, what they wanted to look at is a lag time between vaccination and when they would be analyzing the medical records. And they decided on 6 months lag time, so 180 days. All right, so that means that anyone in that group who had 1 shot or more, the moment they had 1 shot, they counted additional 180 days, and then they looked at the medical records for that particular individual, and that's what they did for that entire group. So 180 days lag time, okay? And then for the non-vaccinated group, they decided to simply add another 180 days from January 1st. So non-vaccinated group were looked at from, say, June 2021 onwards, and they looked at those those medical records, excuse me, versus the 1 times or more vaccination group, anytime you had that first shot plus 180 days, that's when they looked at those people's medical records. Now, for those who had 3 or more shots, they did the same, but the 6 months or 180 days addition was done after the 3rd shot. And because of that, it means, of course, those who had 3 or more shots, they looked at their records much later on, right? Because it was after the 3rd shot. 3rd shot didn't really become available till later in 2021, I believe. And that means, of course, their records were looked at much later on. So that means for the non-vaccinated group, they were compared slightly differently. And instead of looking at their medical records in June 2021, they looked at their medical records in December 2021. So a greater lag time, okay? So what does that mean is that non-vaccinated were compared slightly differently against vaccinated who had 1 or more shot versus those who had 3 or more shots, okay? And what that really means, what I'm trying to tell you is that when the comparison between 1 times versus 3 times, it means that there was more comparison time for the 1 times group versus non-vaccinated versus the 3 times or more vaccinations group versus non-vaccinated. So there was simply less time available to make the comparisons. All right, so that's the background. Now let me give you the details as to what they found, okay? So first, let's take a look at the mortality rates, and here's where we're gonna get one of the first surprises. And actually, before we get there, the general comparison, so when they looked at the groups, non-vaccinated made up about 17% of the entire population, which was roughly around 50,000 people, okay? So the rest was obviously vaccinated, and approximately 2/3 of those, just under of that population, had 3 or more shots, and out of those, about 50% of all of those individuals had mixed vaccines, and Pfizer was the most common vaccine used. This is very similar to the trend in the Western world. And then Moderna, Pfizer was maybe 30-some% of the population used the Pfizer. Moderna was somewhere around 12%. The other vaccines were very, very minor. We're talking about somewhere around 1% at most, okay? So negligible in comparison. All right, so then they showed us the just statistics. And for example, comorbidities were much higher in the vaccinated group, so almost double the rate of comorbidities for any comorbidity in the vaccinated groups versus the non-vaccinated group. Same with cancer rates. So the vaccinated group had about 4% cancer rates versus non-vaccinated group maybe 2% cancer rates. But this is not the comparison we want to make yet. So don't read or look into this yet. And the reason why is because we're not comparing apples to apples yet. And what I mean by that is that non-vaccinated group in general was much, much younger. So if you were to look at their mean age of the non-vaccinated group was about 45 years versus those in the 1 times or more vaccination group was around 50 years. And then if you look at the 3 shots or more was around 53 years. So basically what I'm trying to say is that non-vaccinated group was younger, therefore it's not a surprise that had fewer comorbidities and fewer cancer rates. So what you need to do is compare age to age, gender to gender, and so on. So that's the type of comparisons we need to make. All right, so but those are the general group statistics. So now let's start making the comparisons, and let's start making the mortality comparison first. And again, we're looking at death for any reason. So this is not differentiated for any specific reason why anyone died. It's just you were either dead or alive. And in that time span of those 2 years, approximately 2% of the population died, just somewhere below 6,500 people, maybe 2.2%, okay? But here is the interesting part. They noticed that in that time span, non-vaccinated were far more likely to die than vaccinated people. And again, remember, this is for any cause, for any reason. So for example, remember, we're comparing two different groups, so the comparisons are slightly different because we're looking at different time spans. So if you looked at the non-vaccinated versus those who had one or more COVID-19 vaccine, non-vaccinated were dying at a rate of around 3.6% versus those who had one or more vaccine that were dying at a rate of 1.9%. Okay, and the best way to compare is versus between these two groups is hazard ratio. It's basically the ratio between the two groups in terms of how likely one group is more to die than the other, and the hazard ratio between those two groups was 0.42. So if it were to be 1 over, it would mean that the vaccinated were more likely to die for any reason. And if it's under 1, meaning a fraction, it means they're less likely to die than the non-vaccinated group. And the vaccinated group were almost 60% less likely to die for any reason than the non-vaccinated group. Now, authors do explain this as a possibility as to why this might be, and I'll get to that right away. However, I just want to mention that this is not the first article to mention this, and they actually mention multiple references that have also observed this throughout different populations, and I have made videos discussing this very same trend for the UK data. And here they didn't break it down against age and so on. It's a general trend, I understand that, but the UK data shows the same similar pattern, and it was divided on based for any age group, and in essence every age group showed the same protective mechanism against all-cause mortality for any age. And that's the surprising part, and I've mentioned in those videos that I believe that possibly vaccines might have caused something that is non-specific that allowed people to be protected. I think something was happening that where vaccines promoted some sort of immunological change that was temporary, and the authors mentioned this protection is temporary, that protected tissues, all organs, against damage to such a degree that we were seeing less frequent death in the vaccinated group than non-vaccinated. Again, this is for any reason. So whether you removed COVID from the equation or not, that pattern still holds. So remember, now we're seeing this in multiple geographical locations. Now, the authors mentioned there is some potential explanation, and when I made the video on the UK data, many of you complained and mentioned, no, this is spurious effect. This is likely because of a certain bias called healthy vaccination or bias, or healthy vaccinee person bias. And what does that mean? The idea behind that is that people who are vaccinating tend to be healthier individuals than those who do not vaccinate. And as a consequence, they're less likely to, of course, experience death. But here's the problem with this argument, which sounded very valid when I first heard it from many of you in the comments to the UK video. The problem with this argument is with the data that we're looking at right here. And by the way, this is the same argument that the authors of this publication make. And the issue here is that, well, look at the fact that the non-vaccinated group is actually younger, had less comorbidities, and had fewer cancer rates. So if anything, they ought to be less likely to die for any reason than the vaccinated group. So there is something else going on than just the idea that the vaccinated group of people on such a large population scale happen to be healthier than the non-vaccinated. So personally, I'm not persuaded by this. I think we should be investigating this further and really get to the bottom of what might be happening over there, because this is something extraordinary. However, the UK data suggest, and the authors also mentioned this, that this is temporary effect and eventually it disappears. Not only it might disappear, but it might actually then become a problem for the vaccinated individuals, where the mortality might increase beyond certain time point. And this data didn't reach that time point because they only looked at information till the end of 2023, and the UK data suggested, when they were extrapolating the data that was used in UK, the data suggested that this flip point might happen at some point in 2024. All right. So, anyways, this is the all-cause mortality, and we are seeing a pattern that is repetitive now. Now let's look at the cancers instead. Okay, this is also quite interesting because this protection mechanism that I just mentioned might be of benefit, obviously, but it comes at an expense of potentially elevated cancer rates. Okay, so of course you might argue, hey, listen, who cares if I'm vaccinated and I now have an elevated risk of cancer if I survived? And that's very valid. I think that's a good argument. But nevertheless, let's take a look at the cancer rates. So what the authors mentioned is that the way they looked at the data, it appeared that the vaccinated group were at higher risk of being hospitalized for cancer, for any cancer, than the non-vaccinated group. And instead of giving you the percentages, let me just tell you those hazard ratios again. And the hazard ratio this time was 1.3 for the group that had one shot or more, in comparison to non-vaccinated, versus 1.1. So for the 3 vaccinations or more versus non-vaccinated. So what does that mean? Is that if you had one shot or more in that time span, and remember this would be a large time span, the vaccinated group were 30% more likely to be hospitalized for cancer than non-vaccinated group. And then later on, when you reduce that time comparison between vaccinated and non-vaccinated, that risk increased to 10%. Sorry, I'm wrong. This was 1.2 hazard ratio and 1.1 hazard ratio. So those who had one vaccine or more, their hazard ratio was 1.2, meaning 20% increased risk of being hospitalized for cancer than non-vaccinated. Why I mention that? Because here's the key finding. They also separated this data based on past infection history, and this is where it got really interesting to me personally, and why I even decided to make this video. And here is the information: is that if the vaccinated person had a history of infection, they were less likely to show that they have this cancer risk than if they were not infected. So what it means is that it looks as if infection by the virus for those who are vaccinated gave the vaccinated individuals greater protection. So those who were vaccinated and never infected, according at least to the records, that's where the hazard risk ratio of 1.3 for those who had one or more vaccines in comparison to non-vaccinated came in. All right, so that means they had 30% more likelihood of having cancer than non-vaccinated if they were never infected. And why this captured my interest and why I thought this was really interesting is because of the fact that this fits the data that I've been telling you about the IgG4 antibodies. So if you've been following me for a while, then you know that I focused a lot of attention on these unusual IgG4 antibodies that appear in nearly all of the vaccinated, mRNA vaccinated individuals. All right, so almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone who got vaccinated with mRNA shots, they develop these unusual IgG4 antibodies against the spike protein. And we do know that IgG4 antibodies can elevate your risk of worsening cancer outcomes if you have cancer. They don't cause cancer, but if you have cancer, then these IgG4 antibodies could be a problem. And there is even now a paper, first one I'm aware of, that has shown this, that people who were vaccinated with mRNA shots, their IgG4 antibodies against the spike protein made their cancer outcomes worse, right? So there is definitely a data that seems to be supporting this hypothesis. So what this means is that potentially those who were infected, the vaccinated people who were infected, many of them would have been infected potentially prior to vaccination, and they would have a protection against IgG4, because we also know this, that remember what I just mentioned, almost everyone who got vaccinated has these IgG4 antibodies unless you were infected first. All right, so this is a bit convoluted, but yes, so infection by the virus prior to your vaccination with mRNA shots protected you against development of these IgG4 antibodies. And if you had more and more and more shots, meaning 3 or more shots, I should actually mention 4 or more shots, potentially you might break that protection. There is some data to suggest that. And this is why perhaps the rate of cancer protection with the infection was actually lower in the group of those who had 3 or more shots in comparison to non-vaccinated. It was again a hazard ratio of just around 1.1. So it fits the data. It fits the data. And by the way, how do we know about this? We learn about these IgG4s playing a role in cancer development by introducing this medication called checkpoint inhibitors, immune checkpoint inhibitors, which were supposed to be used to treat cancer, but they were IgG4 antibodies. And in some individuals, they instead develop turbo cancers. Now, of course, that's not a medical term, so don't get fooled by all these experts telling you, oh, there's no such thing as turbo cancers. There is, they're just called something else in medicine, and it's called hyperprogressive disease. And again, we learned this because that medication happened to be IgG4, and in some individuals it worked amazing, but in some other individuals it caused turbo cancers. And I made a videos on this topic, so please check that out as well. So that's the unusual part about cancers. Now also, now what I told you, this was about all cancers, but some cancers were statistically significant than others, and and then 1 times or more group always showed greater impact. Again, maybe it's because it was showing greater time spent comparison, and the cancers that stood out were colorectal cancers, breast cancers, and I believe it was bladder cancers. Okay, and the hazard ratios for those were 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 respectively. Okay, so but here is another very interesting aspect, and this is something about, hey, statistics. It's all about how you play with the data. Remember, I told you they decided to make the comparisons after 180 days after either the first or third shot in the vaccinated group versus 180 days since January 1st, 2021 for the non-vaccinated group. Well, they also decided to do 90 days instead, and the trend stayed the same, okay? All right, so which means basically they compared even more days, all right, between the two groups. And the trend was pretty much still the same. But they also decided to do 365 days, meaning they compared less time. And especially for the 3 or more shots, the time window would be quite small, right? Because some of the people would have the third shot quite late at the potentially near the end of 2021. Add another year, that puts you at a very small time window comparison. Nevertheless, they did compare that, made that comparison, and here is the surprise result. Those who had 3 or more shots, their risk for cancer in comparison to non-vaccinated disappeared. Not only did it not just disappear, they actually now showed 0.9 hazard ratio in comparison to non-vaccinated group, meaning they had 10% less likelihood of observing hospitalization for cancer than the non-vaccinated group. And the authors conclude, look, based on our data, the data shows that in that time span, if you got vaccinated, the vaccination has given you protection against all-cause mortality, and the reasons are not fully known, and it has increased your risk for cancer depending on how you compare the data, and that depends on which cancers you're looking at and how much time you're comparing between the non-vaccinated versus vaccinated group. So, and the reason why I think there might be interesting statistical anomalies in the 365 lag time comparison is because we might be reducing the time of comparison a lot. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention this. About 1.1% of the population was hospitalized for cancer in that time span between vaccinated and non-vaccinated, which was just over 3,000 people. So when you're comparing all of this, there's not that much data to compare against one group or another. And clearly we need more studies like these to make even further comparisons. And I don't doubt at all that we will actually have more studies like these. This is just first of its kind, and the authors did mention there was only one study that they're aware of that might have looked at something similar like this, where they looked at the vaccine effect on cancer rates, but that study didn't compare vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. They just simply looked at cancer rates between 2021, 2022 versus 2020, and the cancer rates increased. Okay, so that was the only conclusion that the paper did, and the paper did not comment at all what could be the impact on the vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. So, all right, this is the summary of the paper. I know this sounded a little bit convoluted and confusing, but the take-home message here is that vaccinations might have temporarily protected the people from dying for any reason, and I suspect this might be real. This might be real, and that effect waned. And again, the authors of this publication mentioned that this is what other publications are suggesting, that this effect might have waned eventually. Okay, and I do think personally there might have been something immunological happening that resulted in wonderful protection against tissue damage, except that eventually that protection just disappeared. And long term, if we're to start looking at longer data points, we'll see what will happen then with that data in terms of vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. All right, and then the increased cancer rates depending on how you're looking at the data. Again, we need to compare this for, I think, longer periods of time than what this paper managed to do, especially the way they compared for the 3 times group, where the comparison time might have been quite narrow for the vaccinated group, simply not enough days, because of the fact that they looked at either 180 days after the 3rd shot, or 90 days, or 365 days. So either way, you know, we have these rumors, anecdotal evidence that there could be cancer rates increasing. This is the first paper that I'm aware of that might be showing that that rumor might indeed be true, depending on how you slice the data. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. And just before I end, please like, please subscribe, please leave a comment, and please check out my Patreon account where I post additional content. And my supporting paying patrons are the ones who eventually vote to determine as to what content makes it to the YouTube, all right? So not all of the content ends up on YouTube, but the Patreon members decide what is the highest quality to determine, or not controversial enough for me to get into trouble to make its way to the YouTube. So if that's of interest to you, please check that out as well. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.